Good day. I want to thank you for joining us today for the UUMUAC Convocation on race and class, intersections and divergences. Just a minute or so of, I guess, if you want to call it now, publicity for our organization. If you are not members of UUMUAC, I invite you to look at our website, which is www.uumuac.org, to find out more about us. In a very brief kind of overview, I would say that, as the name implies, we were founded by an African-American professor who is now deceased, to try to encourage both UUs and others to work together for multiracial unity. We see that through history, whether in the abolition movement or the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, a broad coalition of people across races is the best way to advance justice, particularly racial justice, and that identity politics and other similar strategies have often been used by economic elites in order to make it easier to oppress people for economic gain and to divide people so they don't form a majority that might undermine their control. So that's kind of a little blurb about us. So we have three distinguished authors with us today to speak to the topic. I've kind of ordered them in alphabetical order by their last name. So that means Touré Reed is first, and Professor Taiwo is second, and then Professor Wilson-Hartgrove is last, just by alphabet. So that's the way I tried to go with that. So first, we're going to be having about roughly maybe a 20-minute presentation by each author, and then there will be a time for questions and answer related to that author's remarks. And then hopefully at the end, and I'll introduce each author first, and we'll hear from them. Then I will introduce the next author and so forth. And at the end, hopefully we'll have a little time where if there's a question you think you want to put to all three authors at the same time to see if they want to address that, hopefully we will have some time to do that also. So I'd like to start with Professor Touré Reed, and he's a professor of American and African American history at Illinois State University. And he was kind of brought to our attention, particularly by his book, Toward Freedom, The Case Against Race Reductionism. And his specialty is kind of race and class ideologies and how they affect Black political thought and civil rights politics. So I will let Professor Reed make any supplemental comments to what I just said, if he wishes, before he begins his remarks. But I now turn it over to Professor Reed, and I will mute myself. So any noises in my background, there's a dog in our background, you don't hear until it's time for me to speak up again. Okay.
Well, am I good to go, Alan? Thank you for the introduction. I have to say, this is the first time in my life that my last name put me first in the queue. So I will relish this opportunity for what it's worth. I want to begin by doing something I don't really care for in general, which is to tell you a little bit about myself and my background and how I got into studying race and class inequality. Though it's become a thing for Black professionals to espouse some kind of up from the hood personal narrative, I am, at least in origin, a pretty privileged Black American man. Not only am I third generation Black professor, but my parents, both of them, and all of my grandparents, all of whom are Black Americans for what it's worth, were college graduates, and each of them was or is some kind of white collar professional. I started to become aware of how lucky I was as a teenager in the late 1980s. Thanks in part to my parents' career trajectories and divorce, I grew up in two very different majority Black and brown cities, Southwest Atlanta, Georgia, and New Haven, Connecticut. You can throw New Orleans in too, but we'll keep it simple. I lived in the Sunbelt city of Atlanta from the early 1970s through the middle 1980s, at which point I moved to deindustrialized New Haven, Connecticut. As a child, I was frankly blown away, shocked by the contrasting experiences of the Black and brown people in Atlanta and New Haven. As a teen, I think I would have described the contrast something like this. Atlanta was a city that nurtured me as a Black boy, while New Haven was a city that I found demoralizing, enlightening in a bad way, but found demoralizing as a Black adolescent. It's probably a given that my own demographics had something to do with this, though people in New Haven often mistook me for Puerto Rican. I quickly realized that Puerto Ricans were actually lower on the social totem pole than African Americans. So that mistaken classification did nothing to prevent me from finding my way in the back of a squad car, basically because I was out of place in the predominantly white neighborhood in which I lived. So clearly, some of the demoralizing experiences I had in New Haven, in contrast to Atlanta, were simply due to the fact that I had grown into the category of threatening Black, brown, man child, or man. You know the guy, in the Northeast Corridor. I saw this from childhood through grad school. Be on the lookouts for Black male, or if you're in New York City, a Black or Hispanic male, ages 14 to 44, 5'6" to 6'5". Suspect is wearing clothes. Caution is advised. Suspect has a face. I might have experienced some version of what I encountered in Atlanta, had I grown up in North Atlanta, but I grew up in Southwest, which was predominantly Black, and the portion that I grew up in was solidly middle class. The truth is, what I really found demoralizing about New Haven was the high rate of Black poverty, which contrasted in obvious ways, at least with where I lived in Atlanta, because both cities actually had a great deal of poverty. In Atlanta, all of my Black peers planned to go to college, usually one of the local HBCUs, one of which is where my father earned his doctorate. And I lived in a solidly middle class, lower middle class Black homeowners community. In New Haven, by contrast, it seemed as if far too many of my peers are being groomed for life in a correctional facility. And there were neighborhoods populated by large numbers. There were not many neighborhoods populated by large numbers of Black homeowners in New Haven at that time. But if there were, I didn't know where they were. I say this because what got me interested in the study of race and class is fundamentally those formative years in Atlanta and New Haven. And I want to say, to deviate from the script, in general, I'm not really keen on these kind of biographies because I'm familiar with Clarence Thomas. So people's backgrounds may inform how they view the world, but that can lead to any number of outcomes. Anyway, back to the script. What I came to see through the fuzziest of lenses when I was in high school, which I then gradually put into ever sharper focus in college, graduate school, and finally as a scholar, is that racism alone was and is inadequate as a tool to understand that contrast between Blacks' life chances in New Haven in the late 80s, I think up until now, and Atlanta, at least in the portion of the city that I grew up in. Instead, I came to see the importance of viewing race in the context of American political economy, capitalism, class, whatever you want to call it. My research thus proceeds from the view that the current insistence that we think of racial inequality as wholly distinct from economic inequality fails to capture the root causes of contemporary or even many historic disparities. And as a result, this frame cannot offer remedies capable of redressing material deprivations that do indeed impact Black Americans disproportionately, but not exclusively. The dominant contemporary race reductionist take, and I'll explain what I mean by that, on racial inequality really gained traction around the 2016 presidential race, in particular the 2016 Democratic primaries. Race reductionism, specifically the claim that has gained traction over the past several years, is that liberal social policy has failed to redress racial inequality because liberals suffering from a collective denialism have largely ignored or at least given short shrift to race or racism's impact on Blacks, and they have instead tended to advance class-based policy remedies. As a historian, what's most striking about this claim is it's just dead wrong. While there is no doubt that post-war liberalism failed to redress racial inequalities, that's obvious. What's actually to blame is that liberals who have never been leftists have tended to attribute racial inequality and this is what I mean by race reductionism, to either race Black people's alleged cultural deficiencies, just remember the 1980s through President Obama, or racism, white people's alleged cultural deficiencies, while largely ignoring the disproportionate impact on Blacks of shifts that have taken place in a nation's economy. To be clear, as a Black American leftist who is both a beneficiary and defender of affirmative action and other anti-discrimination policies, I definitely prefer the liberal position over the conservative position, since conservatives tend to attribute extant racial inequalities to the failings of Blacks, period. But as a Gen Xer, I remember the Clinton years very well, and am keenly aware of the fact that because liberals, really going back to the Kennedy administration, are nearly as reluctant as conservatives to acknowledge that our economic system, as is incapable of delivering for poor and working class people. Our system requires them, after all. Liberals can end up in very much the same place as the conservatives. Just recall Bill Clinton's Crime Act, Welfare Reform Act, and Hope 6. Hell, I'll throw NAFTA in for the hell of it. I need to emphasize that when the Democrats shifted to the right by the early 1990s, a period characterized by very high crime, unemployment, and poverty among Blacks, the Clinton Democrats' penchant for talking about inequality in terms of the unique cultural attributes of poor Black people, underclass ideology, which is what this is called, functioned to take the economic foundations of crime off the table. This is how we got super predators as a construct that both Democrats and Republicans embraced quite firmly. But what's interesting about this, though, is that in that moment, the vast majority of Black Americans also got behind tough on crime policies too. I'm going to volunteer that I was not among them, only because I like to vote in primaries. I have been a registered Democrat since I was 18. I was also old enough to vote in 1992. Nevertheless, I sat out the presidential elections of 92 and 96 and cast a protest ballot in 2000 because I could not countenance Bill Clinton's or the New Democrats' racialized war on poor people, of which the Crime Act was an expression of. I want to also emphasize. And that, of course, put me in a minority among Black Americans. I get why, in real time, most Black Americans were not fazed by the implications of the Crime Act or welfare reform on Black Americans. At the most basic level, precisely because class-based remedies to inequality were off the table then, Black Americans took the only path available to them, most of them, to safer communities. So I am not staking out the moral high ground here. In fact, I have no problem conceding that my principled refusal to vote for Bill Clinton and Al Gore way back then was owed in some part to my own class privilege, which ensured that I had lived full time in a high crime community for just 1 year of my 20s, go Holly Grove in New Orleans. But it's worth stressing that during the 1990s, New Democrats joined with conservatives in advancing a moral righteousness about crime that expressly displaced empathy and, of course, political economy from our purview. Via a race reductionist, as I call it, morally charged language informed by the urgencies of now, elected officials, but also regular folk, tended to equate with coddling criminals calls for addressing the economic issues and other social issues, the class issues that inform the high crime rates that plagued lower income Black and brown communities. For what it's worth, I was and still am agnostic in a religious sense, not in a political one. I did attend one of Atlanta's 2 Black Catholic schools as a boy, so I like to joke that the 8 years of Catholic school that I had under my belt made me agnostic. But my agnosticism notwithstanding, I got some good things out of my time in Catholic school. Specifically, I entered Catholic school right just before Pope John II was able to stamp out the remaining embers of liberation theology. This means the Jesus I was exposed to was all about uplifting the downtrodden. It matters as well that I attended Catholic school in Southwest Atlanta during the late 1970s, so the cultural influence of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was quite strong, which further amplified the importance of caring for the oppressed, the downtrodden. This is a long-winded way to say that my secular politics during the 1990s could not countenance Clinton and Gore. And I think those of you who root your politics in a spiritual foundation should be able to appreciate the problem I had with a politics that insists that some of us do not merit empathy. Well, today, I think the tendency to treat categories like non-college educated whites, rural whites, suburban white women, but also Black, Hispanic, Asian, Pacific Islander, as if these categories represent coherent groups with a singular and often enough presumed intrinsic worldview, does the devil's work. It's counter-solidaristic for at least two reasons. One, too often this kind of approach to politics also insists on rationing empathy. My group lost because your group won. So back in the day, so now for my group to win today, your group has to lose. Rationing empathy is tantamount to unnecessarily nurturing resentments. Two, reifying these categories not only obliterates divisions within them, it also compresses out of sight the common interests that transcend these inorganic categories. Black Americans are just 13% of the total population. We cannot win anything meaningful without solidarity. I'll just wrap up with this. If we're interested in redressing inequalities that do indeed impact Blacks disproportionately, but not exclusively, and I know I am, because that's the only reason I got into this profession. Frankly, I couldn't care less about dead people unless I loved them or knew them. So I became a historian to make sense of the now, in part because I know the zombie apocalypse is never going to happen. But again, if we're really interested in redressing the inequalities that do indeed impact Blacks disproportionately, but not exclusively, then insisting that racial inequality and economic inequality exist on different planes that only occasionally intersect does non-affluent Black and brown Americans a grave disservice. So I will stop there because I've gone on for too long.
Okay, thank you, Professor Touré. Professor Reed, excuse me. So we're now going to go into a period of Q's and A's and so forth for perhaps about 15 minutes. And I'd like for people who would like to ask a question, Professor Reed, that they raise their hand. Usually at the bottom of your screen, you will have some controls, and one of them is to raise your hand. After you finish speaking, we appreciate your going ahead and lowering your hand on your own. So I'm first going to recognize Gene. Not sure, he's got probably a hyphenated last name. I just see SH, but go ahead, Gene.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, it is hyphenated and very long. So I just shortened it. So I once asked, I don't know how to say this exactly, but as Unitarian Universalists, we are the church whose publishing house imprint published White Fragility. So that was an imprint of Beacon Press, and I believe she has D'Angelo has another book out. So you have been very sort of like self-conscious about their racial makeup for a long time. And in the context of a church, it's hard to place that as an economically rooted issue. At least I find it hard to tie to the fact that Unitarian Universalists are so predominantly white to economics. But I once asked Ibram X. Kendi at an anarchist book fair if there was, if he had in his book How to Be an Anti-Racist, the solution to how to make an environment that is not really economically driven into, and basically a more diverse or less racist space. And he just said, it's in the book, and I read the book and it wasn't. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on, the Sunday morning segregation across America, and in white, the division in white and black churches. I know you're coming as an agnostic, but Unitarians are pretty theologically diverse. So
well,
I trust
yeah, and I appreciate that. And many of my friends are not agnostic, and a couple of them are Protestant ministers, for what it's worth. So I guess, I mean, the easiest way to address that question is this, and this probably isn't an easy way, since I'm 100% improvising and want to make sense of trying to make sense of the question and connect it to something that I might know a little something about. From my vantage point, one of the problems that confronts contemporary politics, or at least that hobbles contemporary liberal politics, is we moved away from an appreciation of the divide between attitudes and behaviors, which is part and parcel of a move away from the divide between the private and the public. And it's that private public divide that I want to sort of hammer away at, I guess, which will explain why I probably can't fully answer your question, because you're asking a really particular question, right? I do think there's an unfortunate tendency, I hate using the passive voice, but within contemporary liberal politics, there's a tendency to obliterate this distinction between private and public. And you see that very clearly in the work of someone like Robin DiAngelo. So don't worry, I'm going to get there. Insofar as people like DiAngelo, I think this is true of Kendi, who I appreciate more. Even someone like sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva have a tendency to conflate what are really, when you get down to it, projects centered on individual improvement, self-improvement, as if they are the stuff of societal change. I wouldn't suggest for a moment that you can divorce individuals from society. I mean, if we're talking about rattlesnakes, that might work. But human beings are, of course, gregarious. That's one of the key elements of our survival and, for better for worse, domination of the planet. But what went into abolitionism, which came up in the civil rights movement, which I'll throw in here, was not a project centered on individual self-improvement. Those were, when they became successful, anti-slavery, because abolitionism didn't win, right? Political anti-slavery won, which is different from abolitionism. The civil rights movement, which takes place, I would say, reasonably over decades, over at least 30 years, as such, does not win as a project centered on individual transformation. Both anti-slavery and the civil rights movement were political struggles that succeeded because they, among other things, understood the utility of coalitions and understood the utility of political coalitions to win. Political coalitions last as long as they're successful, or eventually unsuccessful, whichever the case may be. But they are centered usually enough on common interests. As I said, abolitionism is a very particular form of anti-slavery. It's the best form of anti-slavery. But abolitionists alone could not win because there were not enough people in the American North who thought that slavery was morally wrong, period, that slavery was doing the devil's work, period. You needed people who opposed slavery because of its economic drag on the society at large, the way that it degraded work, right? You needed other opponents, other people, other populations, other groups' interests who were opposed to slavery for different reasons. And they bound together under free labor ideology. And they got as far as it could go, which certainly gave us the eventual abolition of slavery. Yay. But it also limited how far Reconstruction would go, right? The nature of the coalition itself. A version of the same thing happens with the civil rights movement. As I said, that takes place, I would say, somewhere between, at least what makes sense to understand as the civil rights movement, somewhere between 1933 and 1970, roughly. And a convergence of political issues, coalesce into the civil rights movement over those decades. And many of them are not terribly moralistic, right? I mean, the Popular Front gives you a kind of left language centered on solidarity. The New Deal does a lot of important things, among them bolstering unions, industrial unions specifically, that were racially heterogeneous, racially broadly defined, I might add. Crucially, ushering in what's called the realist jurisprudence, which makes social science evidence, legitimate evidence in court cases, and likewise chips away at the divide between the private economy and the public world, right? That's got to happen. World War II has got to happen. The pushback against eugenics, the Cold War has got to happen, decolonization. Lots and lots of things have to come together to get a civil rights movement. And while we tend to think of the civil rights movement as a moral uprising, truthfully, it's not that simple, right? There's all this other stuff that's not so beautiful in terms of its spiritual implications that's really essential to get the civil rights movement, for reasons I don't need to bother with anymore. How does this relate to your question? Well, again, solidarity is not about finger wagging. It's not about telling people that asserting your own moral superiority over someone else, right? It's about coming together under a banner of mutual interest and advancing as a coalition as far as that could go in the public sphere, right? In the public sphere. As I hear the question that you're putting to me, Gene, you're asking me something that's more of a private sphere issue, right? I mean, I don't know, do you have the right to join a Unitarian church? Yeah, I guess. But it's still a private entity, right? It's not the public space. People choose to join church A, B, C, or D. They can't be compelled to, well, I guess if for tax exempt status, universities had been compelled, of course, to open up.
Let me try to clarify a little bit that,
okay.
Like any church, we think we got a good perspective on things and we want to share it with everybody and bring in as many people as possible. Right. It just so happens that they're like 97% white. So, it's just kind of like, in a way, a church is a private sphere, but, we want to be open doors, open hearts, open to the world.
Of course.
So, I guess that's sort of it feels bad when you think you're good people and not excluding anybody when, right. You're way disproportionate, in terms of demographics and how you look at the world. And that's why we ended up, with D'Angelo and,
sure.
and Kendi, and why we've had all these decades of anti-racist trainings that have gone nowhere. And so we're just, is there a way to go forward or a better way to think about it?
Okay. So again, I mean, I just want to write.
And maybe this is something I want to take back to the rest of the Unitarians too.
Right. Yeah. But I think what you're asking about is how to connect with prospective members, right? And that's why I would say that's a private concern that I can't speak to in a direct way. I'll be a little cynical though, which is that one of the reasons that I'm a lapsed Catholic, I was baptized Catholic. This is not the lax part, but one of the reasons I grew up Catholic is my family. Both my grandmothers are from New Orleans, so they happened upon Catholicism the old-fashioned way. Their parents were Catholic. I believe the people who had owned our family were also Catholic. So one of the disadvantages, perhaps, you might be operating under, and again, I'm being cynical to be sure, is just that, right? You wouldn't have had the entree into Unitarians, wouldn't have had the entree into Southern American culture. Black American culture that in a state like Louisiana, Catholicism did, or throughout much of the rest of the South, other Protestant sects, such as Baptists and Methodists among them, and Presbyterians did. So that's a disadvantage, I suppose, from a certain vantage point. I'd honestly never heard of Unitarians until I was in high school. And it was through an interfaith, a friend who was Jewish, but her parents were interfaith And she explained Unitarianism to me in that particular context. Again, that might be an expression of the obstacle that you confront. On the anti-racism training front, though, which it makes sense that you guys would have engaged in that. And again, you have to do what feels right to you. I can't weigh in on your institutional dispositions. I've not been very keen on my experiences with anti-racism training, and it's not because I want to hang out with racists. I don't, honestly, but I found a lot of ironic racism in the anti-racism training that I've had to suffer through. And specifically, I've found a disposition to what some of us might call essentialized Black culture, really problematic and infuriating. I mean, stuff that in a bygone era would have been considered racist is now supposedly anti-racist. A presumption. I'll give you one small meaningless example, and this is not from anti-racism training, but when I was hired forever ago and was still in grad school, as ABD as they like to call it, and when my coworkers took me around the local community, I didn't know they were offering me the job, but they were, and they took me around to sweeten the deal to show me real estate. And a couple of them who were driving me around town wanted to take me by a Black Baptist church. And I said, well, I'm agnostic, but I was raised Catholic. So if you're going to take me to a church, you're going to take me to a Catholic one, right? But they made an assumption. This is an innocuous assumption. I have many noxious versions of this, though. I just like to lead with the innocuous one. They made an assumption that because I'm Black American, I'm Baptist. It was infuriating. Well, it would have been infuriating had it been a higher stakes version of it. It was annoying, is what it was in real time. I've seen the higher stakes version of it and witnessed it on committees. I've witnessed it directed toward me, again, in higher stakes. And it's a problem. But anti-racism training often, at least the versions I've endured, and I've read D'Angelo's first book, and she would be guilty of this, are guilty of insisting that non-whites share a coherent culture. Frankly, D'Angelo seems to presume that white people share a coherent culture too. And if you're a Black American, you would know, and somewhat reflective, you would know that's not true, right? I mean, if you're any kind of person, any human being, you would know that racial groups do not share. The only way that racial groups can share a coherent culture is if the Nazis are right about what makes people tick. And I'm just going to assume that we all think the Nazis were wrong about what makes people tick. But just the easiest way to put this, up until recently, I think everybody knew, at least all the white people in America knew this. Some may have forgotten it, that Englishmen, Frenchmen, Germans, Lithuanians, Russians, and we'll skip all that are omitted, who are white, don't share the same history, speak the same language, don't operate under the same laws, practices, and customs, right? So up until pretty recently, the only people who talked about white culture were Nazis. However, that tendency to that many whites, of course, understanding that there intuitively there was no such thing as white culture, didn't extend to Black and brown people. We talk about, and I've had this experience in all of the anti-racism stuff, talk about Black culture or Hispanic culture or Asian culture. How could there be one, right? Given what those groups consist of. So I would say that, and maybe I'm just going to be alone on this, I can live with it, that I'm not sure that traditional, what anti-racism training has come to mean, really is helping that cause in the grand scheme of things, because it tends to compress out variety within groups and insist upon pretty rigid distinctions separating groups. But again, I mean, the question that you're asking me fundamentally is a private concern, and the only thing you can do is organize, right? The only thing you can do is do outreach and sell of course, Unitarianism on the basis of its inclusivity and its commitment to human decency. And I think, you know, you'll connect with the people you connect with, and you won't with others.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Reed. I was not seeing a lot of hands raised, so that's why I was allowing both the follow-up question and, you know, extended answer. Hopefully, most of the time, questions will be able to be addressed with a shorter time frame. I did see one other hand raised, and then it was taken down. This was from Tessie Bond. So I do want to ask her: have you withdrawn your question, or do you have it? If not, we are going to go on with the program. Tessie, you're muted. You'll have to unmute to respond. Okay, I don't see her responding, so I assume she has withdrawn her questions. Well, Dick, are you trying to ask a question? You're muted, Dick.
Yes.
And try to keep it short because we do
Yeah,
want to move on.
It's just very short. You've talked about Kendi and D'Angelo. What's your opinion of John McWhorter and his book Woke Racism? Because he has quite a different angle, and I assume it has some intersections with yours, but I suspect there's some differences too. I'd like to understand that.
Okay, I'll try to keep it as short as possible. First, ironically, one of the proposed titles for Toward Freedom was Woke Racism. And I rejected that title on the grounds that that would likely connect with the Tucker Carlson set, which is not what I wanted at all.
Right.
Professor McWhorter wouldn't have had that concern. I think one of the interesting things about John McWhorter is he has been a pretty sharp critic of contemporary anti-racism, of, you know, particular expressions of it, like the 1619 Project, BLM, and some of his, and reparations, and some of his criticisms have, you know, would seem to harmonize with mine. The funny thing about it, though, is that whereas John might start off at a point where I begin, he actually ends up where his critics, where the people he's criticizing are. Professor McWhorter, I think, has a pluralist understanding of society, right? And tended to fall back, unless something has changed in the last year or so, tends to fall back on the notion that groups rise and fall on the basis of their coherence. And again, I mean, his critique on some level of 1619 and BLM or whatever is a critique of pluralism of a sort. The notion that everyone gets their own history, I think, is kind of one of the things that animates his criticisms there. But oddly, you know, what the reason I would be critical of those putatively progressive movements is they're not that progressive. They are superficially, but part of the problem is not all of the problem, is the pluralism that drives it, the presumption of coherent racial group interests. That's a serious problem. I want to say one quick thing, because I've also been criticized as a class essentialist. I think the people who would criticize me as a class essentialist are working with an entirely different definition of essentialism than I am. I don't think class organically translates into progressive politics. There's no evidence of that, actually. It's not an automatic thing. Class is a basis, potentially, is a potential basis for political mobilization. And it's a potential basis for political mobilization that can go a long way toward improving the lives of Black Americans who are not, you know, Ivy League educated. And I think part of the problem, and of course that necessitates a particular vision of coalition building, that demands, of course, with an eye toward a more fair and just society, demands an equitable or more equitable redistribution of capitalism's reward, or maybe even moving away from capitalism altogether, who knows? But I think John, once more, even as he kind of rejects racial essentialism at the front end, he ends up embracing a pluralistic vision of progress that is akin to the groups that he criticizes. And so to an extent, last thing I'll say, Professor McWhorter has given me plugs in the New York Times and Barbara Fields in New York Times. I don't know if we're a means to an end, but he does not understand himself to be a fellow traveler with us, and nor do we understand ourselves to be, as nice as he is as a person, nor do we understand ourselves to be fellow travelers with him. We share a front-end critique of some contemporary expressions of putatively liberal politics, but we go an entirely different direction with it. In part, again, last point, because that stuff seems way too conservative to me. I mean, it's not terribly ambitious. It's the kind of stuff project that whose dividends are going to be received up the ladder and not down the ladder. It presumes a racial trickle down. So,
Okay, thank you, Professor Reed. I'm going to now move us on to Professor Olufemi Taiwo, and he's a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. He came to our attention particularly through his book, Elite Capture, How the Powerful Took Over Identity Politics. And a lot of his research and writing has been on the intersections of climate justice and colonialism. So I'm going to let Professor Taiwo make any supplemental comments to introduce himself that he wishes, and then to talk to the subject for which we have come together, race and class and those differences and intersections. So
thank you. Thanks to everybody for letting me be part of this. You know, in general, I like getting to talk in front of groups that have a kind of spiritual basis for their thinking about organizing and activism. I grew up in the church, but in particular, you know, my father-in-law is a kind of staunch UU member. So my wife and I, when we're up there visiting the in-laws, get to attend the UU church. So I'm particularly excited to get to speak to y'all. I will try to be brief just for the sake of moving along time-wise, but there are a few kind of basic ideas that I went for in the book Elite Capture that I hope will be useful. Elite Capture, in the broadest strokes, was a critical defense of identity politics, or if you prefer, an invitation towards a better identity politics that is aligned with solidarity as a value and aligned with the coalitional politics that having that value makes possible. And I wrote the book with an eye to that. You know, my experience in organizing spaces, particularly in the 2010s, was one where I perceived a kind of growing suspicion about coalitional politics. I perceived there to be a kind of growing impatience with working across identity divides and a growing willingness to employ for counter-solidaristic purposes the kind of essentialisms that Professor Reed was just talking about. So there was a presumed kind of pecking order of lived experiences that would be compatible with the right kind of politics, and those lived experiences were thought to be closely connected with the kind of identity labels that we place on people on the basis of their race or gender or religion or things like that. And so Elite Capture was my attempt to respond to all of that. And one of the ways that I responded to that, and in retrospect, I really wish I had done a better job kind of explaining what I wanted people to get out of these examples. But one of the things that I ended up doing over the course of the book was talking about historical examples where identity politics and identity-based struggles were linked closely with what you might think of as more orthodox class politics, and these actually worked in a productively combined way. I think the most notable example that comes up in the book is the linked anti-colonial struggle of the Bissau Guineans and Cape Verdeans against the Portuguese fascist government. And among the points I make about this particular struggle, or amongst the facts that I bring up about it, was that although the people participating in that struggle understood that struggle as part of the larger African anti-colonial movement, they understood the Portuguese fascist government to be racist, and they understood their struggle against that government to be a struggle against racism, to be a struggle against colonialism. They also understood it to be part of the linked global struggle against capitalism and the forces of the world that were most strongly fighting for the maintenance of capitalism and the kind of political inequalities that crop up under capitalist systems. The leaders of that movement were veterans of the Portuguese anti-fascist movement. Many of them had cut their teeth politically organizing in Lisbon against the Portuguese fascist government. Many of the countries that gave some material support to these revolutionaries were not African. The Swedish Social Democratic Party was funding school materials in Guinea-Bissau. Cuba sent doctors. The anti-aircraft missiles that they used to fight against the Portuguese Air Force were supplied by the Soviet Union, and training for many of the military officials was provided by China. Right, so there were all sorts of groups that were materially involved in this particular kind of struggle between African revolutionaries and a particular racist European government. And that was because all of those places understood that struggle as linked to theirs. And there was a strategic alignment, I suppose you could say, between African anti-colonial struggle, understood as anti-racist struggle, and the broader kind of class struggle that the Cold War involved. So I try to use examples like that to say what I'm saying in a more theoretical kind of valence in the book, which is using this term elite capture to directly respond to these tendencies that I was seeing in organizing. So what is elite capture? Well, elite capture is a term that I was borrowing and have been borrowing from, for the most part, social scientists. And when social scientists use this term, people that do development economics or sociologists, they tend to be describing situations where aid dollars or the composition of some kind of economic project gets steered towards the interests of the most advantaged few. So the World Bank says they're going to build some wells in a global South country, and they have to decide where, and the farmers who have the most land get to decide where the wells go. You know, that kind of scenario. The one kind of small tweak I make towards the social science version of this conversation is just a turn in direction of breadth. It's a flexible concept. And so I just suggested, well, we can, in general, understand the agendas of political movements, of social movements, as showing us the same flavor of phenomenon, right? Political agendas might be shaped by the most advantaged fractions of groups, even if those groups are in general marginalized groups. So there's a storied and classic discussion of the way that anti-racist politics got appropriated or changed or shaped by the Black middle class, by the sociologist E. Franklin Frazier. There have been contemporary discussions of how the political desires and priorities of white gay men have, punched above their weight, so to speak, in the broader queer movement. And, examples abound, but we can generally get the flavor that a more advantaged group, a more advantaged fraction of a marginalized group might be able to exert more control or influence over the politics of what fighting for that marginalized group looks like. And so that is the phenomenon of elite capture. And the most important thing about it, for the sake of the book, is that I use this phenomenon of elite capture to criticize the style of identity politics that I had identified before, the style that was suspicious of coalitional politics. And I broadly label that style of thinking about identity politics as deference politics. It's a politics that sees identity politics as a sort of zero-sum game where gains for one kind of identity come at the expense of, or at the very least have a sort of default adversarial nature to the potential for gains for some other part, for some other identity group, right? So Black women are in competition with Black men, or Black women are in competition with white women, or trans people are in competition with cis people, however we'd like to run it, right? This way of understanding how our identity politics positions us with respect to other people that are also striving for life opportunities and health and wealth and all of the things that we fight for under the banner of politics. It used to be common to demand that being a good member of, I suppose you could characterize this as the kind of center left or radical liberals, as people sometimes like to say it, but people who wouldn't necessarily style themselves as leftists in the conventional terms of the 20th century, but who nevertheless were influential members of the broader post-2000s growing social justice milieu of politics. And among the norms that developed amongst these people were the ideas that passing the mic to the most marginalized person in the room, or appealing to one's lived experience to shut down or navigate or settle political disputes, was the right way of recognizing the importance of identity politics and lived experience, the contribution that our identities make to what kind of politics is possible for us. And if there's interest, I'm happy to go through the argument there, but the claim that I end up making over the course of the book is that this is a way of doing identity politics that supercharges elite capture. This is a kind of worst possible version of doing identity politics if you have elite capture in mind as something to avoid, or at the very least mitigate. So two other things I'll say about elite capture before I close out. One of the main upshots of this way of responding to the problems of, I guess you could call it neoliberal identity politics or deference politics, however you'd like to label it. One of the things I'm trying to respond to, and one of the ways that I'm trying to insist that this criticism of identity politics is compatible with seeing a potential upside for a different version of identity politics, is by pointing out that elite capture is a systems behavior, right? It's a result of power dynamics between groups and institutional relations or lack thereof between groups, right? So it's not a story where I just take the worst offenders of social justice norms, or the authors of books that are perhaps misguided, and lay this problem at their feet, right? Their behavior is just something that emerges from a system where There are few organizations that can speak on behalf of majority, and there's poor accountability relations between leaders or simply rich and advantaged people and broader marginalized groups. And so we should expect versions of identity politics that are maybe less well considered than the versions I would be in favor of. But we don't need to think that this particular individuals making the mistakes are in and of themselves the reason why we've gotten this poor version of identity politics. I'll leave it there for now. I'm happy to say why I think that's useful. But the second upshot that I wanted to bring up is maybe just as important. For all the press that this particular weakness of identity politics has gotten, you know, the kind of willingness to steer political projects that should be for all, or at least for all within a marginalized group, and steer them to the private interests of a few advantaged people. That's not a unique problem that identity politics has. And I think at this point in 2025, the idea that other modes of thinking about politics are also susceptible to the attempts by well-positioned people to steer public dollars or attention or political systems to their personal advantage. I think it's probably clearer now that that's not a unique problem of anti-racism, but again, happy to say more about that if there's interest, but I'll leave that point there. So that is what gets done in the book Elite Capture. I try to say there's a better version of identity politics out there. We have some historical examples of it. There's nothing, well, I shouldn't say that. It would be worth it to try to build towards that version of identity politics. And the last thing that I'll just close out by saying is that in this book, as in a bunch of other things I've done, I try to motivate an alternative that I label constructive politics, which is just a description of broadly the things organizers might recognize under the term base building, more ecological understanding of political struggle. But you need to build actual alliances and the kinds of organizations that can pursue those alliances and pursue strategic leverage. So things like workers unions, tenants unions, debtors unions, you know, ways of building relationships on the basis of solidarity between people can be done in ways that are sensitive to identity politics or that are inclusive of identity politics, but importantly in ways that involve wielding power that isn't limited to one identity group, right? There's at least in the best cases, unions aren't racially segregated, debtors unions aren't racially segregated, tenants unions aren't, nor are they gender segregated or so on and so forth, right? And so if we have these vehicles for converting our understanding of what's wrong with sexual harassment or residential segregation or any of these kind of ground level manifestations of broader bigotries, if we have organizations and ways of doing politics that don't just oppose these aesthetically or don't just express opposition to these, but actually build the kind of power and leverage that can force building the world in a different direction, building housing that isn't segregated, building healthcare that doesn't exclude people who don't have enough money, et cetera, then we would be doing something that was more like the Bissau-Ghanaian anti-colonial case than it was like the, you know, performative campus politics version of identity politics. And that would be a politics worth building. So I'll stop there. Thanks again for having me. Looking forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you, Professor Taiwo. So again, I'm going to ask if you have questions to raise your hand using the raise hand symbol at the bottom of your screen, or usually it's at the bottom of your screen. It might be elsewhere in how yours is configured. So I see a couple hands. First, I saw that from, I don't know if she's taking it down. I saw Barbara Jean Walsh have a hand up, and then David Wilcombe. So let me ask first, Barbara Jean, have you withdrawn your question?
I didn't have a question.
Okay, I saw your hand up, so, okay. I'm gonna go then to David Wilcombe to ask his question.
Thank you, Alan. So my question would be for either of the professors. My daughter's single mom, she's Hispanic because her mom was Latina from Peru. And my daughter has a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old boys that are African American because their fathers are. And since they were young, I helped them. I would encourage them to read. And I got them several years ago a book about Harriet Tubman that was written in those terms that children of that age could understand. And I was telling my daughter that she should encourage the boys to seek out African American books on heroes that they can use in their book reports. So for either of you gentlemen, could you post on the chat or tell me, is there a clearinghouse or a link where I can go to review books that I could consider sending to my daughter to give to my grandchildren? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if Professor Reed has any suggestions. The thing that came to mind to me was the Zen Education Project. They work with a lot of K through 12 teachers, and they collect lots of great history about the history of activism in this country and elsewhere. I'm sure they would have stuff about Peru as well, but I would check them out.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Please raise your hands. Okay, I guess we have Jean asking one again. So go ahead, Jean.
Yeah, sorry. But Mr. Taiwo, you sort of, I think, made an allusion to progressive stacking as a feature, as a tool used in certain radical radlib spaces. And it's funny enough, our General Assembly, which we have every year because we're Congregationalist, is coming up in Baltimore in about 2 weeks. And we've been doing progressive stacking for speakers at our General Assembly for several years now. I believe the things that shuffle you to the front of the line are being a person of color, disabled, queer, or fat right now. I was wondering if you had anything more to say about the utility or disutility of the progressive stack as a tool within organizational spaces, which our General Assembly is.
Yeah, I mean, so progressive stack, I've had a fairly mixed experience with. It was used in my union local. I've been in a number of groups where it's been used. And I think the kind of what I've picked out as a kind of deciding feature as to whether it was innocuous or good or bad is kind of the goal that's articulated by the group of what progressive stack is supposed to do, right? If the idea is, left to our own devices, the same 12 people will talk at these meetings, and we want to hear from more people, and we want to be mindful of the way that, those 12 people might overrepresent particular perspectives. I think that's probably fine, so long as, we're not accompanying that with the implication of, because we've heard from this particular disabled person, we have thus heard the disabled perspective, or, you know, the person who gets to speak first is the person who is likeliest to be true on this matter. If we can wall off that kind of, I think, less helpful ways of doing progressive stack, and that less helpful way of understanding what is good about progressive stack, then I think it's at least innocuous, maybe good. But it really depends on what people think they're accomplishing.
Okay, thank you. Dick, either you or Mona, I guess, have a question.
Well, I'll ask you the same question I asked Professor Reed earlier. What do you think about John McWhorter and his way of doing things? And you know, one of the things he remarks is he thinks that this woke movement, as he made people call it, has some strong religious characteristics. And if you have and religion is often, in that sense, kind of hierarchical kinds of religion. So if you have any comment on his analysis or point of view.
Yeah, I think my response is much like Professor Reed's. You know, I think at the kind of surface level, I'd probably agree with many of the criticisms. I think I would take more care to distinguish the kind of criticisms I would make of the so-called woke groups of people from the kinds of criticisms that right-wingers would make of them, right? So yeah, broadly I would, and as for the specific point, I think we're right that there is a kind of religious inflection to some of the norms that emerged in the social justice communities, particularly in the 2010s. The ideas of checking your privilege, or in general kind of positioning yourself in the right way to your personal identity or history, does kind of seem like a quest for salvation at some point, right? Which I think meaningfully changes the subject of politics from, you know, how do we be saved? How do we be good people? Where the question of politics, I think, is more appropriately, you know, how do we accomplish specific goals, right? How do we get healthcare for all, or how do we get housing to a level where people don't have to be homeless? Things that aren't about, you know, whether we're personally the right kind of person, personally righteous, and are about, you know, concrete things that happen in the world. So I would agree with that level of the criticism, but I would be very careful to make it in a different way than I perceive him as making.
Sorry, I muted myself because of background noise. Thank you. Eric.
Yeah, thanks. By the way, incidentally, you say your name, Olufemi?
Femi's good. Femi Taiwo.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
Professor Taiwo, excellent. So yeah, I heard you say like the American, you know, progressive idea with the identity politics as supercharged elite capture. I'd like to understand that better. So what exactly is the mechanism that does that, and what would be in a different model, what would be the mechanism that would not be doing that would be doing more, I guess, more broadly representative non-elite capture?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it relates, I think, to Gene's question as well, right? So, you know, what is it that we're doing in a particular room when we uplift the voices of marginalized people in that room, right? I think that's part of the question of what's going on with progressive stack. I think at a lot of these, you know, major cultural institutions, you know, fancy institutions of higher ed, or you know, newspapers, media outlets, they found themselves in this position where, you know, among the things they're being asked to do is to, you know, uplift the most marginalized person, but the most marginalized person in the room, right? The most marginalized person who made it into those zones of interaction, right? Obviously, there's a range of people and life experiences at Harvard, but it's not quite the same as the range of people and life experiences that you might find at your average high school, right? Because Harvard selects for certain kind of people who get certain kind of wealth or social connections or educational achievement, you know, all those. So the idea is, if we're worried about elite capture, we might actually, you know, further distort our understanding of what marginalized people face if we are sitting at somewhere like Harvard and we decide to uplift the Black or Muslim or queer or trans person in that room. And so the better idea would be, you know, mass politics, right? You know, I think predominantly Black unions are going to have a much larger range of perspectives and a much larger source of information to draw on, just because there isn't, in fact, one, you know, Black experience or one way to experience racism. And so the more different experiences you get, the more likely it will be representative of a larger population of people. So that's what I have in mind.
Okay, cool. Thanks. That makes sense.
Okay, so next question is from Matthew Shear.
Thanks. Hi, and let me just say I'm really enjoying these presentations. It's just great. Thank you so much for appearing. What came to my mind listening to the previous questions is I recall a column that was in the Chronicle of Higher Education a few years ago. It was called "That's Just Your Opinion," where a professor had said, you know, I went over a paper with a freshman and showed all these things, and he said, well, that's just your opinion. And the columnist said, well, this student fails to recognize the difference between opinion and argumentation. And so when I hear the word elite, I mean, I want to ask all of our speakers really, is cultivating, you know, reasoned argumentation itself considered elite and shutting out some voices? Or is there, or conversely, is there a responsibility of those who wish to opine in the public space, a requirement that you have to sort of have some basis other than that's just how I see it, that's just how I feel? I think that's the most succinct way to put it. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll start. Maybe Professor Reed will have something to say about this too, but I don't think, you know, if anything, I think the exclusion of people from spaces where they're asked and encouraged to say what they think and why, you know, that's the elite thing, right? And in the best scenario, you know, a genuinely democratic union space, for example, would be, among other things, a place where people could give arguments, give reasons, give motivations for the things that they think is true and the things that they want to see in the world. And I think it's not elitist to demand that. And maybe the other way of kind of making the elite capture point that I was just explaining is, in a way, it's kind of hyper elitist to say, you know, of the few Black people that make it to Harvard, or the few, you know, Muslim people who are on the editorial board of the Times or whatever, or the few marginalized people that make it into these elite spaces, that they not only get this high salary or whatever, but they get this ability to speak on behalf of a group, and speak on behalf of the group without even making arguments, right? Without recourse to evidence or argumentation. You know, I think that is a especially elitist view, and not one that serves really anyone. well, I don't think. So I strongly am on the team of, we should ask more for argumentation for reasons, and we can do that while respecting people's different perspectives and experiences.
Okay, thank you. I think we are going to move on for purposes of time. I could ask one question now, but I think I'll ask it for all the authors later. So we're going to go now to Reverend Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove, and he has a degree from the Duke Divinity School. He's a minister, but he also is the assistant director of Yale University Center for Public Theology and Public Policy. And he came to our attention because he is co-authored with Reverend William Barber a couple books, one on the Third Reconstruction and another on white poverty that a number of us have read, one or the other of them. And so this is along the same theme of these race and class and differences and intersections that relates to the subjects in that book, those books. So I turn it over and I'll let Reverend Wilson-Hartgrove add any additional things that he'd like to say about himself, and then make his remarks. Okay.
Well, thank you, Alan, and thanks to all of you. It's good to be with you. These two books that you mentioned are in some ways a kind of practical meditation on the challenge that both of my colleagues here have presented us, which is the question of how do we build coalitions in the context where we find ourselves in order to achieve a politics where everyone can be well. I think that's the big goal, and I'm grateful for the UU and for the ways that y'all have engaged in that around the country. I've had the chance to work with some of your local congregations and with the national denomination at different times. I see several of you are from Florida, which reminded me of your great involvement several years ago in the ballot measure to get folks who had been incarcerated re-enfranchised. I know your congregations really showed up for that. So I'm grateful for those concrete ways that we've connected. With both the Third Reconstruction and the White Poverty book, I have worked with my friend and brother and real teacher on the practice of what he calls and learned from his father to call moral fusion politics. And so I thought I would just sort of talk about what that has looked like in a couple of different contexts, and then we can kind of come back to this conversation because there's a lot to sort out about how we practice this, but this is sort of where we've learned this. First was here in North Carolina. The book, The Third Reconstruction, is really the story of the moral movement that was born in North Carolina, largely in response to something that we're seeing at the national level right now, which is a takeover of the government and then an attempt to deconstruct the government while people have power. That happened here in North Carolina in 2013 when extremists who had taken over the Republican Party here had control of both chambers of the state legislature and the governor's office, and then began to use that power to dismantle state government. And Reverend Barber, I think very insightfully, started going around to advocacy groups that were beginning to be concerned because their issue was being touched, whether it was voting rights. The largest groups that had been working on voting rights were the NAACP that he led and a group called Democracy North Carolina. And but there were also LGBTQ groups. There were groups that had been advocating for an expansion of healthcare. There were unions that had been advocating for an expansion of wages. And in all those cases, he listened to what people were concerned about, and then asked this question: who is it that you see blocking what your people need. And they would tell him, and he would say, "Well, I've been going around talking to these different groups, uh, and these folks who have amassed power in Raleigh, everybody says that they're the people who really get in the way of what we need. So if those folks are cynical enough to stick together against all of us, we ought to be smart enough to come together." And that was the basic argument for building a fusion coalition. But the other challenge that we face in politics is that people, in addition to the identities that we've been talking about, people also in politics tend to have a kind of political identity, right? This is the political group that I associate with. These are my people. And part of what we were trying to do is build a broad enough coalition to overcome this attack on government itself, on even the very idea that we should have government, by building as broad a coalition as possible. And that meant saying that we weren't doing it as Democrats or as Republicans or independents, but rather we were doing it for moral reasons. So moral fusion became a way of saying, let's reframe what's at stake, not in terms of left, right, but in terms of what's right and wrong. And fusion being, let's try to bring together and build a coalition of everyone who either is or could be impacted by this, or because of their own moral convictions, believe that that people who are being impacted by this are folks that they should stand with. And Moral Mondays in North Carolina grew out of that, and that's the story we tell in the Third Reconstruction. That I think is the sort of basis for what we're trying to do right now, which is build a moral fusion coalition nationwide, and to again build as broad a tent as possible to oppose the deconstruction of government that the current MAGA movement and Trump regime is carrying forward, not just in the kind of daily drama from the White House, but very much in terms of policy, and in the policy that's being pursued in Congress right now. So the second book that Alan mentioned, the White Poverty book, is one way of trying to get at the problems of this sort of identity politics and the sort of assumptions that come with it that we've been discussing some, by saying that so often an issue like poverty, which impacts this whole country, and really impacts every community in this country, more so than we recognize, because poverty is a much bigger problem than we see. We take some time in the book to sort of redefine poverty and explain why the official poverty measure of the federal government really doesn't capture the fact that frankly, 60 to 70% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. And if you use a measure of poverty that takes seriously how many people are just a few $100s away from literally not being able to make it next month, you get somewhere around 43% of the country. So there are a lot of people living on the edge in the richest country in the history of the world. And in that context, there has been a steady march towards more and more money going to the top, and programs that in any way help or assist people who are struggling to get by being cut in the name of responsibility to the taxpayers, or cutting waste, fraud, and abuse, or whatever language gets used. So in that context, one of the ways that poverty gets diminished is that it gets racialized. We've seen this since the real success of the civil rights movement in terms of expanding federal programs that people used to think were good, were suddenly labeled as programs that quote unquote help Black people, and therefore were demonized by people who began to attack them. And so to talk about white poverty is in some ways to interrupt the assumptions of the racialization, to say actually that there are a lot of people who are raised white in this country who are also facing the ravages of this inequality, and that if we can see them and see the connections between white, black, and brown folks who are, and Native folks and Asian folks and others who are who are facing poverty, then it's possible to build the kind of fusion coalition that I was mentioning earlier. We've tried to do with moral fusion politics. So that's what we try to do in that book, and try to tell stories of how groups like the Union for Southern Service Workers here, and it's based in North Carolina where I am, is this interracial fusion group that is bringing low-wage workers together around an issue that impacts them, and are framing that in moral terms, in terms of like this being something that's about right or wrong, such that they are appealing to folks like yourselves, folks that have some sort of moral conviction about what's right and wrong in the world, and inviting people to join the struggle, even who are not directly impacted by it. And so anyway, that's just a kind of brief summary of what moral fusion politics is. But I'll just introduce that and sort of join the conversation with everybody, because I think it's sort of our way into this conversation of how do we deal with the dynamics of identity in the midst of the real need that everyone recognizes to build a big and a broad coalition that can pursue a government that actually works for everybody.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to again, and I will be among them, but I'll ask folks who want to ask a question to raise their hand. You know, I've got my screen on gallery view, but that doesn't show everybody. But if you raise your hand, you'll come up on the first screen, and I'll be able to ask those questions. So I'm going to go third, but I'll ask the first two where I saw hands pop up first. So I first go to Matthew.
Thanks, Alan. And again, thanks to all of our speakers. I have, of course, for these broad coalitions, my concern is that in order to give them the power to affect change in society, it has to work through the political process and through the political parties. From my perspective, I was raised what was called a liberal Republican, but that does not exist anymore. And I think today's politics has not really given us a choice except to work through the Democratic Party, unless we're going to take a longer course to try to take back the Republican Party towards liberalism. But given today's reality, how do you translate the broad coalition into electing Democrats who will actually put them into the institutions of society? Thanks.
That's a great question about our political reality. But I think you're right that we exist here in a two-party system, and we have to deal with that in terms of elections. But I also read American history in a way that I understand movements to have a capacity to move what parties are concerned about. So while I would agree with you that, you know, given where we are, there's an importance that the Democratic Party has to play in terms of, you know, checking the abuses of power that are happening right now. I also think that there has to be a movement that changes the priorities of the Democratic Party, because part of the reason that we, you know, have, I mean, there are essentially two kinds of populism. There's some sort of, you know, democratic populism, which is roughly what I was talking about in terms of the Union of Southern Service Workers earlier, and what I've heard in, you know, some examples that others have shared here. There's also fascist populism, which, you know, in some ways is not genuinely serving you know, popular interests at all, and yet it does appeal to a kind of sense of grievance and loss that that is widespread. And it seems to me that fascist populism is a fair description of what has given rise to the Trump regime in the United States right now. And in order to have a Democratic Party that can check that, I think there has to be a movement that pretty radically shifts the priorities of the Democratic Party. I'll just say briefly that this white poverty book that I mentioned came out just before the election last year. And we went to the Democratic National Convention and tried to make the case that that a Democratic Party that could overcome Donald Trump in the election really needed to reach out to poor and low-income people, and not just sort of invest in campaign workers or something that would go out, but to really have a clear commitment to policies that would motivate people who were low propensity voters, not because they didn't understand the impact of policy on their lives, but because, based on surveys that we had done, that people didn't believe that either party made much of a difference in their lives. This is a kind of fundamental fact of American politics as it exists right now in every presidential election for decades now. We've had more people who didn't vote than the people who voted for either candidate. And if you do the sort of demographics on that crowd that doesn't vote, it's an overwhelmingly low income crowd. And when you talk to those people about why they don't vote, they say because they don't think there's anybody who represents them. So we tried to make the case that if the Democratic Party wanted to be successful in overcoming the candidacy of Donald Trump a second time, it needed to reach out to poor and low-income people and advocate for things like raising the minimum wage to some semblance of a living wage and universal health care and things like that. And well, I think you all are aware that that was largely rejected by the Democratic Party in the 2024 election in terms of the priorities and the language that the principles of the campaign were willing to use. So, what's going to change a party that that makes those decisions for their own self-perception of what's in the interest of the party and its leaders? I think it has to be a movement that demands it. And so building movements, I think, has a capacity to shift what the parties that exist are willing to do.
Can I take a moment to respond to that, Alan?
If it's brief.
Well, yes, brief. As someone, I chose to get involved with Democratic Party politics in my town committee for this reason. From my perspective, taking it to the national convention is so late in the process. And I've been telling people this year, unless you're in Virginia and New Jersey, is a year to build that kind of coalition to influence the formation of those groups that then show up at the conventions in those years. And it has to come from at that level to influence who ends up.
Oh, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
And instead, what I see is we're speaking truth to power, and people say, I don't expect anything of Republicans, so I'm going to just hammer away at the Democrats. That actually weakens their ability to do these changes. That's what I have experienced. I would encourage people, you want a better Democratic Party, try working within it and wrangling your local committee to do these things. And it's hard work. It takes time. Thanks.
Okay.
No, and I'll just say to that real quickly that that this was not the first time, we or many people in our movement have been in conversation with the Democratic Party. And there are some things that, as you're saying, have over time happened. There was no poverty caucus in the DNC 2 cycles ago, but there is one now. And there are, some ideas coming out of that caucus. There are some postmortems that include a significant attention to just these questions. So I'm not saying all is bad, but I'm saying that I do think we have to have like you're saying, movements from the grassroots up that work very hard to push the conversation in a new direction.
Okay. I'm going to go next to Joyce Francis because I see Dick's hand up, but he's spoken a couple times before. So I'm going to let Joyce speak next, then I'll speak, and then we'll probably go to Dick after that. So Joyce, you're up next.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I wanted to say that I'm enjoying this very much. Thank you to all of you. The first gentleman spoke about the lack of coalition amongst religious groups, how divided we are every Sunday morning. And that frustrates me. It seems to me this is a moral issue that we need to tackle in our country, and we're better than it amongst spiritual groups. And yet, I've worked with a Baha'i group here in our town, and I put in the chat about tomorrow being Race Amity Day. It's a national Baha'i movement that's been 100 years old, that seeks to celebrate those times when people of multiracial groups have come together and worked together. And we did a class within my former Unitarian fellowship that is UUA allied, I'll say, and asking them to join this movement here in our town. And the answer was, no, we can't work with those Baha'is because they don't share our commitment to gay marriage. So I think that gets in our way. We think we have to only gather with people who share all of our values. Why can't we drop that and say, as I believe we should, this is important to all of us. We let the other things go for the moment. Let's work on this one together. Any thoughts? How do you get
Amen to
past
that. I don't find the purity tests too helpful.
No.
I mean, in my experience, we don't all agree on anything, but if we can find, if we can find an agenda that we can come together around, I think that's it's pretty basic to democratic politics, but it's also pretty basic to community building. And just to go back to one of the conversations we had earlier, I mean, there is a distinction between the private and the public, but I think there's also a lot of culture that transitions between the private and the public. I mean, we are. I've been a pastor long enough to know there's always politics in the church, right? And a lot of the politics in the church is sort of connected to the politics in the broader culture. And part of what you're saying is that we need to have a sort of practical orientation toward building a life where everybody can be well, even when we don't all agree. I think that's a pretty important culture to build, both at the congregational level and out in our attempts to build coalitions in the public square.
Do you think our churches are becoming more purity testing?
Well, as was suggested earlier, there's I don't think it's inherent to Christian faith, but I do think that it's a particularly religious temptation to self-righteousness. I'm going to speak pastorally here for a moment. There are some sins that are particular to who you are, and religious people don't recognize that religious people are susceptible to religious sins. But if we paid more attention to our religious texts, we would recognize this, because the religious texts are always, I mean, the prophetic voice is always challenging the self-righteous. Now we like to project the prophetic voice on other people and sometimes use it to make ourselves feel righteous. But the reality is, right there in our stories, we have a kind of internal call to check this self-righteousness, and I would draw on those traditions to address what you're talking about, which is the way that self-righteousness can lead to purity tests, and purity tests can say, well, we can't work with those people because they're not as good as us on whatever. And in reality, people have all kinds of things that we come to different conclusions on, but the democratic experiment has been about trying to find a way that we can share a common life together. And that's an experiment that has been messy in many ways and never entirely fulfilled. And yet I think it's the best example we have of a way of being together that creates more justice for more people.
Can I add one thing that just harmonizes with what's been said already, which is that the solidarity that one needs to advance the case for what Joyce is calling for, which can call for checking purity tests, right? Which Jonathan has likewise harmonized with, can also be the stuff of nurturing mutual empathy and eventually embracing perspectives or people who you'd previously stiff-armed, right? You'd previously understood to be the forever unknowable exotic other, with whom you have nothing in common, can never have anything in common. But the process of coming together and working for common cause can chip away at people's unacknowledged prejudices. And to be perfectly honest, not only was that baked into the NAACP's case in Brown, and even the Supreme Court's verdict there, that's what diversity used to mean too. Like, there are multiple visions of what diversity means. I'm not a fan of the current dominant one, but an earlier version that was commonplace, and you could see this in Harvard's amicus brief in Bakke, is just this thing I said, right? That that shared experience can encourage people to reassess their assessments of people who had previously been alien to them.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask a question now. And this, I think, Reverend Wilson-Hartgrove partly addressed this when he said that many in the moral fusion movement were trying to get the Democratic Party last year to change it the way it was addressing certain issues. And also addresses a little bit of what Professor Taiwo was talking about, elite capture, that we noticed that through times there are politics in this country, particularly Democratic Party politics, has often tried to focus on let's address the concerns of a political, a certain portion of what they can see as their potential electorate. So it may be Black Americans or LGBT Americans, whatever, and they will take a position based on what elites in that group are trying to put forward. I could think of in 2020, you had the movement concerns. They were the call for defund the police. And even polls have shown that even African Americans, the majority weren't taking that position, but a lot of people, Democratic politicians, put forward that position, and that may very well have hurt their chances, even though they won the presidency and majorities in the House and the Senate. Those majorities in the Congress probably would have been larger, and it would have been more effective if they had not pursued that kind of argument. And it seems like those kind of things continue to appear. There's like a proposal at our faith's General Assembly that's talking about, and it's very poorly worded or vaguely worded, but about potentially abolishing the prison industrial complex. Well, we can all say there's problems with a lot of the prisons and everything like that, but to go to extremes like that, if that's picked up by political groups that saying, oh yeah, this is what a portion of our electorate wants, without really seeing that it's reflective of the broad population, even of a certain subsegments, whether it's, Black Americans or LGBT, etc. They're just taking elites' voices and saying, this is what we should speak to or support, seems unwise. And so how do we try to, get our political leaders to really try to understand what is in the best interest of the broad population and really has that support, rather than taking these narrower identity politics positions? So that's my questions. So it's partly to, it could be to any of you, because I particularly talked about lead capture, but it also talks about what Reverend Reed was talking about, that groups try to put everybody in a certain glass, or group in a certain box. Like he was giving the example of all African Americans being Baptist or whatever it may be. So it's just the same thing where let's think about the broad interest and how do we get away from that, looking at and get to a broad interest and get away from identity groupings like that. So I'll let any of you speak who feel that you have something to contribute.
Well, I would love to hear Professor Taiwo's read on how elite capture was at play in the 2020 election. That's an interesting question, and I think might help all of us, understand that framework a little better. But what I was saying earlier is essentially what our movement has been trying to push in terms of the priorities of a very broad coalition that is made up of a lot of people, but that often fails to address the folks who economically are struggling to get by. Some of those people are within the party, but part of what I'm saying is that many of those people do not identify with the party because they don't see that it has much to offer them anymore. And that has been a change in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was broadly perceived as a party of the working class for some time, but partly because of the policies of the 90s that Professor Reed was talking about, there was a real shift away from that. And I think, people on the ground paid attention, maybe even in ways that the party leadership has not. But anyway, I'll pass it to the two of you.
Maybe I'll just say quickly, we have this kind of split approach to these things where either we seem to elevate very particular individuals from marginalized groups as spokespeople, or we have this other mode of just social science poll testing, right? So we deal with individuals as active participants in politics, or we deal with populations, but we deal with them as kind of passive participants in politics. And I think finding a way to combine those two is the way that we get a much better way of representing broad interests. And I brought up unions, but it could be the Poor People's Campaign. It could be a religious association of people, in a sense, you could say the Southern Christian Leadership Conference played that kind of role during the civil rights movement. But there need to be kind of broad-based organizations that don't just poll people to find out what they believe and then empower elite individuals to act on behalf of that. There need to be ways where people get to participate in deciding what a movement is going to do, and channels of communication between grassroots and between officials where, if people are pursuing politics that or political ideas that don't have broad-based support, that there can be a conversation about that. There can be accountability if somebody goes out ahead of where their membership is willing to take them. And that's something that at their best are built into the known vehicles of small d democratic politics, like tenants unions and workers unions and whatnot. But if there are other ideas for how to organize that, I'm game. But those are just the examples we have historical purchase on.
So the problem of elite speaking for the masses, I think, is kind of baked into an identity politics framework, right? Calling the categories identities confers to those groups a collective interest. It, I'll beat the dead horse. It compresses out the variety of experiences and perspectives that one would find in a population that is comprised of 45 million or more Black Americans. And I have said this many times elsewhere, and I'll say it again, there are literally more Black Americans than there are human beings in Canada. And yet no one will ever suggest that there is a single Canadian way of looking at the world. And yet we talk about a unitary Black identity, right? And to connect this to, I think, what something Jonathan had said earlier, and I'm sorry, it's the weekend. I've been on sabbatical. I'm all about first names rather than titles. So please, you don't call me Touré. Just don't ever call me Touré. That's that other guy who doesn't know how to pronounce our shared first name. But anyway, and has been the bane of my existence for a while as a result. But anyway, to connect this again to a point that Jonathan had raised earlier, perhaps badly, since I'm improvising 100%. the Democrats have made clear in the last decade that they don't want to win with a class agenda. This is old news that poor people don't vote, right? I mean, this is not news in the grand scheme of things. And it's not news that poor people don't vote because in the end, they don't think that the parties are going to offer them anything. And the parties are committed to not offering them anything meaningful other than resentment. And the Republicans have been selling white identity politics for decades. Goldwater, maybe Nixon, Reagan for sure. And the Dems have responded with non-white identity politics, I guess, or what we actually think of as identity politics anyway. And that's well thought out on their part. This is not a coincidence. And I think in 2016 and 2020, the Dems have made clear that they would rather win with an Obama strategy that centers on so-called identity issues, which can function very easily to paper over the problems that are in fact systemic and structural in the society. If one presumes, as people did in 2008, that President Obama functioned as a proxy for Black men with his bogus up from the underclass Horatio Alger story, right? Having grown up, having been not knowing his father, been raised by a single mom or his grandparents, struggling with the value of education while smoking the reefer in high school or whatever, omitting his class advantages, right, and to the nth degree. But if President Obama could function, candidate Obama and then President Obama, as a proxy for Black Americans, then what you got from that narrative was an insistence. I saw this in real time. It was quite aggravating that Black men in particular just need to pull up their pants and study harder, and the system's basically fine in terms of the class dynamics of it, right? The opportunity for upper mobility. And that framework is essentially what the Dems imagined, thanks to Demography is Destiny, anyway, which did the devil's work, would be the pathway to victory as an alternative to pursuing universal economic programs. And the last thing I'll say, because I'm blathering and I apologize, but I've been traveling, so what do you want from me? The last thing that I'll say on that front is a clear expression of this very issue. I'm going to take this back to the Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign, because that's a jump off or an opportunity for exactly what Jonathan was talking about. And we know how the DNC responded to that. The way that identity politics was deployed, and I don't see this as co-optation. I don't. But the way that the Dems deployed identity politics was quite striking, because they took the position that Bernie Sanders was a class reductionist and therefore did not care about racial inequality. And Hillary Clinton, I think this was the first debate, said something to the effect that regulating the big banks would do nothing to address the problems of systemic racism. Regulating the big banks, I mean, it was a dodge. I need to say that from the outset. That was a sham, what she did. But regulating the big banks would have gone a long way to ensuring that Blacks wouldn't have been overrepresented among the victims of the subprime mortgage crisis. Her husband signed into law. This is what was utterly outrageous about that. The bill that repealed Glass-Steagall would set in motion this very problem that did, in fact, impact Blacks disproportionately, though not exclusively, right? And so, again, the way that the party used identity politics, this is when they accept racism as a problem. They rejected racism as a problem from Bill Clinton until 2016, right? But the way that the party used identity politics was to blunt exactly what Jonathan was talking about as what is necessary for a path forward, with the irony being nobody on the left was suggesting that racism was a thing of the past. You never heard from the Sanders campaign that a case against affirmative action. You did hear from Bill Clinton flirtation in the early 1990s with chipping away at affirmative action. And I think we're in serious trouble here. I suspect that the way the Dems are going to go, and I say this because of Ezra Klein, is to double down on now under the name of abundance, but to double down on the growth politics that got us in this mess to begin with.
Thank you. So we're almost done, but I'm gonna go back to Dick. That probably will be our last question. I'll make a few commentary, closing remarks. Dick.
Yeah, I picked up on the use of the word moral and when you talked about moral fusion and your fusion project, Jonathan. And that's because it struck me that there is a very strong yearning for, among lots of people, to be on the right side, to be moral, to be virtuous, and that this has been taken over by identity politics. I think that's one reason why McWhorter and others regard as kind of a religion. You've mentioned your own attitudes there. So I think it's identity politics, sometimes called woke identity politics. I think woke hints at that virtue signaling that's going on there. It seems like that's captured the moral vision and activism of many people on the left, and you're trying to recreate a moral vision more focused on poverty and things like that, and that seems to be real tension. Do you have any ideas of how we can sort of shift away from this morality focused on the victimhood hierarchies of oppressors and oppressed and all that kind of stuff towards the real moral vision that you have?
Well, I always tell people I'm not against being awake. I think it's better than sleepwalking.
Right.
But but that being said, I've already suggested that I don't think the purity tests and the sort of everybody working in their own camp has a great political future. So your question about how morality might be involved. I mean, I think we need to cultivate a sort of generosity to recognize people's longing for what is good and true and right in the traditions that they come from, and to recognize that actually intersects in a lot of ways. The UU actually gave us the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. That's right out of your tradition. But there are many traditions that that can, like streams flowing toward a river, can come together, and that's what we're trying to do in terms of building a moral movement to help people tap into the best of their traditions and see how it can invite us to work with one another.
Right on.
Okay, thank you all. So in conclusion, I want to first remind our three authors that if you haven't yet provided us with your home address or whatever address to which you would like your honorary check to be sent, to please send it to either myself or to Dick Burkhart. Most of you have gotten our email addresses. If I get it, of course, I will send it on to Dick. So that's one point. Second, for any of you who arrived late or didn't get to participate in the whole convocation here, the recording of this will be posted on our website, which is www.uunuac.org. Within the next week, we have a thing where it says checking out our YouTube channel. You click there and you have a whole slew of programs that we have had over the years, and usually, and the most recent one will be at the top. So in a few days, a recording of this program will be at the top if you click on that link. And of course, you can tell people who maybe didn't hear about this in advance that you enjoyed it and you thought it was worth participating in, and then recommend it to others so that those folks can watch the recording once it's posted. So, and again, any of you who are new to our organization, we encourage you to go to www.uumuac.org to look over the things that are there. We have our mission and vision statement, which we have updated this year. That gives you a good sense of what we're about, and you can look, explore other parts of the website. And if you choose to join us with a contribution, that would be great. We appreciate it. We do have expenses, just like the honorarium here for other things. So those membership costs or contributions help fund those things. So with that, I'm going to bring this convocation to an end. Again, thank you all for your participation, whether as speakers or as attendees and questionnaires and so forth. And with that, I bid you adios, bye,
Great.
etc.